Easter, a time for fake grass, plastic eggs, these things, chocolate bunnies, and people dressed as bunnies. And then there are the weird parts of Easter, like fake grass, plastic eggs, these things, chocolate bunnies, and people dressed as bunnies, which is interesting. But what does all this stuff have to do with Easter? And if this holiday is about more than candy and wearing uncomfortable clothes to church and lunch with your relatives, what makes Easter happy?
Happy Easter, everyone. I am really excited about Easter coming this year, but I've got to admit it's kind of weird, right? These quarantine rules have kind of changed how we celebrate Easter. And for me personally, I am thinking through a lot of the traditions that we do as a family and what we can do and what we can't do. And to be honest, they're a little weird. I mean, Easter's supposed to be a happy time, but I don't understand why we do some of the things that we do. For instance, we eat an unreal amount of candy. I don't know where that came from, but all I know is that I will go through multiple bags of jelly beans, except for the black licorice ones, because I'm not a psychopath. But other than that, jelly beans. We color eggs, and our kids paint them. We hide them in the yard, and the kids look for them, and it's a fun game. Sometimes the adults look for them too, and it gets a little competitive, and people get a little mad. They don't talk to each other until they see each other at July 4th. But we work it out. I think the funniest one, or the one that I think is the most interesting, is watching parents force their kids to take pictures with the Easter Bunny. I don't know if you did that as a kid or not, but for me personally, it was terrifying. In this series, we're going to talk about some of the reasons why we celebrate Easter. We're going to talk about why it's such a big deal, particularly if you are a follower of Jesus. If you're like me, growing up, you might have wondered why we celebrate Easter. But during the series, we'll talk about not only what we celebrate at Easter, but also what that can and should. Also, why that can and should make us happy. But before we get there, let's talk about this last one for a second. Let's talk about the Easter Bunny, because honestly, I can't get over this. Does the idea of a huge bunny that you sits in a chair and you sit with them for a picture seem weird? Let me prove my point. Check out these pictures. I have to admit, those pictures are hilarious, but they're also terrifying. Some of those Easter bunnies have no business being around children, let alone being on camera. I mean, Easter is mostly a fun holiday if you consider those pictures. For those kids, I'm not sure how happy they were. But even the family's probably not going to make you dress up and sit down with the Easter bunny this year. You can thank the quarantine for that. I think that we all know that feeling, though, the feeling of being scared. We all know that fear can take away our happiness almost faster than anything. And fear, it takes different forms. As kids, when we were little, different things scared us. Things like breaking a toy, losing a toy, the fear of the dark, which, to be honest, that's still scary. The dark is still scary. I don't know why we're supposed to grow out of that. You should be afraid of the dark. But for me personally, as a kid, I was really afraid of quicksand. I can't really explain that to you. I think I just saw it in a movie. But I gave a lot of thought to quicksand and not wanting to fall into it. I definitely grew out of that because I've never seen quicksand. So I don't know if it exists. Fear can wreck our sense of peace and happiness, though. And as you get older, your fears change. You might not be afraid of the same things anymore, but you still experience it. You might be afraid of rejection from friends. You might be afraid of embarrassing yourself, especially if it ends up on Instagram. That's terrifying to think about, right? You might be getting cut from a team, failing a class, trying to ask out somebody that you have a crush on and being rejected. Fear looks different, but it ages with you. And you've probably figured out this part, right? That you can't outgrow fear. You might even call it something different now. You might call it stress. You might call it worry. You might call it anxiety. But it doesn't. But it stays with you. Whatever your particular fear is, you don't need me to tell you that it's very real. The reality is that fear is on the rise. In fact, chances are good that if you're watching this right now, fear is determining the direction of a lot of your life. Maybe you are making decisions to do or not do certain things because of fear, or you're avoiding people or relationships or conversations that you should have based on fear, or maybe you're numbing yourself with your phone, spending hours and hours scrolling, trying to avoid doing something or seeing someone that you should be. Whether we realize it or not, fear is fueling a lot of our thoughts and actions. Here's what's really interesting about all of this. If we were to boil it down, there's one fear that I believe connects all of our other fears, and that's the fear of death. Now I know what you're thinking, holy cow, I was not really ready to talk about this. That's a big topic. I'm really trying to not think about a fear of death. I prefer to think about quicksand, honestly. But this is not just about physical death. It's about the end of something. For example, think about it in relation to some of the fears that you have right now. So we're afraid of really truly being ourselves because we think that if people know the real us, they'd freak out, they'd run for their lives, their friendships with us would end, their interest in being our friend would be over. We're afraid of not getting into college because if our application gets rejected, the dream is dead. We're afraid of getting busted or found out when it comes to some secretive stuff in our lives because that would mean other people's perfect image of us would die. Whether it's physical death or the death of something we hope for, the fear of death comes down to losing something that we'll likely never get back. And when you think of it that way, it's easy to connect almost all of our fears back to the fear of death. You see, death seems final. It's like a final knockout punch from fear that gives it victory. Our fears come true. If our fears come true and our friendships end, or our goals die, or something that, or we fail in some way, and we get to the end of our lives and we realize that death defeats us once and for all, like that's terrifying. That's devastating. There's no hope in that. And you certainly aren't happy. But that's what I want to talk about, because that is what Easter is about, actually. Because in the middle of all of that hopelessness, in the middle of death, we have Easter. Easter inserts itself. And as we head into this season, you might have heard that the point of this whole holiday it's not about eggs, it's not about chocolate, it's not about pastel colors, it's not about the Easter Bunny. For those of us who follow Jesus, what you've probably heard is it's about how he came to the earth, died on the cross for us, and then was resurrected and defeated sin and death. That's why Easter is a big deal. That's the big deal about Easter. It changed everything, and it especially changed the life of a guy that I want to spend some time talking about right now. His name's Paul. Now, if you haven't heard of Paul, Paul is this really influential guy in the New Testament. He wrote a lot of the letters after the Gospels in the New Testament. What's interesting about him, though, is that he was, before he did that, before he was this really influential Christian missionary person, he was actually persecuting Christians. He was using fear to threaten people to abandon their faith. He would even use the fear of death. But he actually met Jesus, as in he met the died on the cross, resurrected Jesus, who came and appeared before him, and it changed everything. The guy who used to threaten Christians' lives became the greatest missionary. He was shipwrecked, he was imprisoned, he was threatened and beaten and bit by snakes. I don't understand that one, but he kept going because he was so passionate about people understanding the significance of Jesus' death and resurrection. Paul's life was constantly in danger. In fact, he was eventually killed for his faith. But despite all of that, Paul seemed to live without a fear of death. And in all of Paul's letters, we can kind of see why. Paul writes this one letter. He writes in the letters 1st and 2nd Corinthians to this ancient city called Corinth. And he was reminding the people that Jesus died and came back to life by his own power 3 days later. Then Paul, let's listen to what he writes. So go to your Bibles. In 1 Corinthians 15, we're going to look at verses 54, or part of it, and 55. And he says this: "Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" And what's cool about this is he's actually quoting a verse in Hosea in the Old Testament. He's recalling something that is written, in the Old Testament. It's like Paul is taunting the very idea in recalling this scripture by reminding the Corinthian church that on Easter, death lost to Jesus. When Jesus died and rose again, he defeated death. And that means that because of the resurrection, death can no longer defeat us. The power that death has over our reputation, our relationships, our future hopes and dreams, and even our physical bodies is gone thanks to what Jesus did on Easter. We no longer have to fear any kind of death because Jesus destroyed death once and for all. After Jesus hung on the cross and was placed in a tomb, it seemed like humanity's greatest fear had come true, right? It seemed like the Messiah could be killed. And his followers were terrified that they had wasted their time, that they had given their life up for something that wasn't true. But when Jesus walked out of the tomb alive, it proved that even the power of death wasn't strong enough to overcome the power of Jesus. This is why Paul was able to live the way he did, no longer fearing death. It's why he didn't seem to fear. It's why he didn't seem to fear much of anything in his life after he encountered Jesus. He seemed to realize that the scariest things aren't the most powerful things. The things we fear don't have the same power that Jesus does. Paul trusted that the fears he faced were no match for the power of the resurrected Christ. In other words, Easter means fear isn't final. Right? So Easter inserts itself into the middle of hopelessness to tell us that it's not final. If Jesus can defeat death, he can defeat the things you're afraid of. Fear will try to convince you that it gets the final word, that at the end of the day, it will win. Fear will try to convince you that you're not good enough, that you'll never find a purpose, or that your life isn't worth it. Fear will try to make you listen and obey it. That's what power is all about. But here's the truth. Fear is only powerful if it can convince you that it's final. Fear is only powerful if it can convince you that it's final. Fear will try to make you believe that nothing is stronger than what you're afraid of. But when Jesus defeated death itself, he showed us that nothing we fear is bigger than him. Nothing we fear is stronger than him. He showed us that fear, no matter what we're afraid of, doesn't get the final say. You might be thinking, you can't just tell me not to be afraid of anything because Jesus died and was resurrected. I'm still anxious. I'm still depressed. I'm still worried. I'm still terrified of what might be lying ahead. And, I get that. Even if fear doesn't get the final word, it doesn't take away the fact that bad things happen to us, or bad things could potentially happen to us in the future. I'm not telling you I'm not telling you that none of that will happen. I'm not telling you don't have to be afraid of that. But what I am telling you is that you are more equipped to handle those things than you may realize. Paul says it this way. He says it in Romans 8, in verse 11, he says this: "The Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you." So let's think about that for a second, okay? Paul is saying that the same power that defeated sin and death 2,000 years ago, when Jesus rose from the dead, is actually living inside of you. Maybe that's why Paul seemed to live free from so many of the fears that we typically face. Was that, and if you can embrace the significance of Easter in your life, maybe you could too. When you have faith in Jesus, the power that brought Jesus back to life is inside of you. And that means that fear doesn't get to tell you what to do. You may have turned the video on today controlled by all sorts of different fears. Just know that if Jesus defeated death, The Spirit of Jesus who defeated death can live in you. He can. Imagine what his Spirit can do in the face of the things that you're afraid of today. Let me ask you this. Where has fear been holding you back? Think about that for yourself. Where is fear holding you back? Is it in your relationships? Is it in dreaming big for your future? Is it in going to college? Is it in dealing with something concerning your mental health? Is it doing something that you know you should do no matter what it does to your reputation? Or is it actually exploring faith in Jesus? Because up to this point, you've been afraid that your life might change. Wherever fear has been holding you back, with Jesus' help, you can take a step forward facing it today. What step should you take to prove fear doesn't have the power over you? Maybe it's forgiving somebody, apologizing to someone. Maybe it's talking to your school counselor. Maybe it is seeing a doctor and starting a conversation. Maybe it's telling your parents about something you never told them. Maybe it's asking a small group leader for help with something you're afraid to admit. Maybe it's asking honest questions about Christianity. This Easter, no matter what your step is, you can begin facing fear because of Jesus. Because of what we celebrate at Easter. What Jesus did for us. Fear doesn't get to determine the direction of our lives any longer. I don't know what your step is, but I do know this. If you're somebody who believes that Jesus defeated death and you follow him, then his power is living inside of you. Because of that, you can handle whatever fear throws at you. No matter how scary it seems, remember, you're not facing fear by yourself. You're relying on the power of the one who defeated your greatest fear once and for all. He took away its power, its victory, and its sting, and that means that you don't have to worry about anything being more powerful than Jesus. This is the hope that the Christian faith was built on. This is what caused Paul to live free from fear, and this is what makes Easter such a happy holiday. While the rest of the world lives controlled by fear, driven by stress, you and I, we don't have to do that. We're free, and that's just one reason that we can say Happy Easter.